Good evening, everyone, and welcome. A lot of reverberation in this mic here. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're very excited to be hosting Fareed Zakaria, who's here to talk about his new book, Age of Revolutions, Progress and Backlash from 1600 to the Present. But first, I'd like to thank our friends here at St. Paul's for allowing us to use this lovely church, which, like P&P, is a fixture of the community here. We're very fortunate to have such a great venue near the bookstore to use for larger author events such as this. Fareed, I'm sure, is familiar to many of you from the CNN Global Affairs show he's hosted for 16 years, Fareed Zakaria GPS, and from the columns he writes for the Washington Post. He's been an influential presence in the media for over 3 decades, starting with his time as managing editor of the journal Foreign Affairs. He then edited Newsweek International and served later as editor-at-large at Time Magazine and a news analyst at ABC News. Along the way, he wrote several best-selling books on such topics as populism and threats to democracy at home and abroad, the rise of non-Western powers, the importance of a well-rounded education, and lessons for a post-pandemic world. His writings and on-air commentaries have earned Fareed a reputation for incisive, clear analysis of world events. His new book is his most ambitious yet. It offers us a framework for understanding the revolutionary times in which we live, times marked, on the one hand, by tremendous progress economically and technologically, and on the other hand, by seismic social disruptions, deep anxieties, and political backlashes. Fareed argues that this sort of action and reaction, this dynamic between progress and backlash, is a feature of past revolutions, and in his book he looks at a few examples going back to the establishment of the Dutch Republic in the late 16th and early 17th century, England's glorious revolution, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the United States. He contends that the amount of revolutionary change in recent decades, for all its benefits, may have been too much and come too fast, which helps explain why we're now seeing in places an eroding belief in such classic liberal ideas as individual rights and open markets, and a rise in populism, isolationism, and other illiberal trends. It's a thought-provoking thesis and argument, and Fareed covers a lot of ground in his very engaging and informative book, so there's much to discuss this evening. And who better to moderate the discussion than someone who also thinks big, explains clearly, and writes lucidly, a journalist and author, Tom Friedman. As an outstanding foreign correspondent in the 1980s for the New York Times, Tom covered the Middle East, winning 2 Pulitzers in the process, then served stints as the New York Times' chief diplomatic correspondent, chief White House correspondent, and international economics correspondent. In 1995, he became a columnist and won a 3rd Pulitzer 7 years later, and on top of all that, he's written 7 books, all bestsellers. And oh, by the way, he and his wife, Anne, established the Planet Word Museum recently, and that's in downtown DC, and if you haven't visited yet, I'd encourage all of you to go there. So please join me in welcoming Fareed Zakaria and Tom Friedman.
Thank you. Is this on? No, it's not. How's that? Better. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. Brad, thank you for hosting, and thanks to St. Paul's for having us here. It's just a great pleasure and treat for me to be here interviewing Fareed on this great book, Age of Revolutions. Nobody gets out without buying a copy. I just want you to know, okay? Author to author. So let's dive in, and we're going to talk, Fareed and I, for about 45 minutes, and then I've got some questions that people submitted, and I will share those, and I'll leave plenty of time again for you to buy books. Fareed, there's always a moment when you're thinking about an idea, and one day you wake up and kind of the engine turns over and you say, that's a book. Get my publisher on the phone. Walk me through that moment for you. How did you sort of sneak up on this idea? When did you decide that's a book? And give us a short summary of the thesis.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Politics and Prose. Thank you to the church. And most importantly, thank you to Tom Friedman. When I was managing editor of Foreign Affairs, Tom and I used to talk. And one day, he quoted me in his New York Times column. And I called my parents, and I told them, guys, you'll never believe this. Tom Friedman just quoted me in his column. So to come from there to here, it's a huge honor and a huge pleasure.
Vice versa. Thank you. Thank you.
So I do remember, Tom, you're right. It was around the time of the beginning of the Tea Party. And I was paying a lot of attention to it because what I was struck by was the fact that the Tea Party seemed to be upending the rules of politics. This was an insurgency movement within what had traditionally been a very hierarchical political party. The Republican Party, remember, this is the party that people always said about their presidential candidates, you know, Democrats like to fall in love with their candidate, Republicans like to fall in line with their candidate. And yet here you had this insurgency movement that was attacking mostly the establishment of the Republican Party. And I remember reading a book by a really wonderful Yale scholar, Theda Skocpol, where she goes and spends time with them. And she discovers that while its origins, you remember, were all about economics, you know, Santelli on CNBC going and saying we should have a Tea Party, the core motivating concerns for these people were all cultural. They were talking about immigration, they were talking about multiculturalism, diversity, what we would today call the woke agenda. And that, you know, thinking about that, it made me start to wonder, are we watching something new happen in politics? And then I noticed another thing, which was by 2014, 2015, it was pretty clear the United States had come out of the great financial crisis, the global financial crisis, better than any other country. And yet, something that always happened when you saw rising economic tide and rising perception of economic tide, by then you were seeing consumer sentiment, you know, started to boom. Barack Obama's approval ratings were flatlined. They just weren't moving. And that very tight correlation between economics and the politics, if you will, the president's approval rating, had broken. And so those were the kind of moments that I remember thinking there's something here. I, in fact, called up my agent, exactly as you say. We signed a contract. At that time, the book was called Beyond Left and Right. And what I found was as the time went on, events seemed to be confirming my fear. Then you have Brexit. Then, of course, you have Trump. And I begin to realize that there's something going on here that can't be explained by normal politics. And the basic thesis of the book is that we're living through a period of extraordinary revolution. And by a revolution, I mean a period when the basic economic, social fabric of society is upended by vast structural changes like economics, technology, and that when these things happen, you always get two things that happen along with it. First, you get an identity revolution that goes along with the changed economics and technology. I mean, you see this, I start with the Dutch in the 17th century, and it's fascinating to me. They basically invent globalization or modern globalization by inventing tall ships and navigation and joint stock companies and a stock market and land and water management, and they become the richest country in Europe. But they're not a country yet because they think of themselves as part of the Habsburg Empire. And this, this economic and globalization revolution produced an identity revolution. They stop thinking of themselves as part of the Habsburg Empire. They start to think of themselves as Dutch. They stop thinking of themselves as part of Christendom. They start thinking of themselves as Protestants. And they break away. And then what you see is a backlash in almost every one of these cases. Even in the Netherlands, after a while, there forms a party, the States Party, that basically says, this is all too fast. This is too much. Let's slow things down. We're uprooting our old traditions, our old customs, our old mores, and I'm going to take you back to when it was better. I'm going to take you back to the good old days. I'm going to make the Netherlands great again. So we've had this cycle for a long, long time in history, and I tried to use that history to inform the present.
Fried, you call the revolution in the Netherlands the first great liberal reform revolution. Talk a little bit more why. What does liberal mean in that context?
Yeah.
Because we're talking about the 1600s.
So it's a very good question, because they would never have used the word liberal to describe themselves. Why is it such a fundamental break? Why do I pick the Netherlands? I said on Colbert, I'm very high on the Dutch, which was unintentionally hilarious. And Colbert, of course, says we all are high on the Dutch. But if you look at average income of human beings through history, believe it or not, there is a great economic historian who has put together data for 2,000 years. And for the first 1,700 years or so, that is a flat line. Average income around the world for thousands of years is about $200, $250 per year. And it doesn't move, just stagnation after, century after century. And then it starts to nudge up, and then you get the hockey stick graph, where it goes to $2,000, $5,000, $7,000 per capita GDP. The beginning of that move is the Dutch, is the Netherlands. They're the first country to invent a modern economy, an economy based not on land and agriculture, but on innovation, technology, knowledge. And why does that happen? It happens because they finally figure out that what you need to do is to invest in human beings' brain power, find interesting ways to build bigger ships, find interesting ways to allow people to invest in those ships. So for example, the joint stock company is an invention to pool risk, because otherwise nobody would finance these trips, because 1 out of every 2 boats would sink. But if you do it, if you pool the risk, you had a way of doing it. You create a stock market. You bring land from the sea. And in doing that, what they realized was they needed a politics that was open, that embraced change, that empowered new people and enriched new people, not just the old aristocrats, that was tolerant of ideas. So Spinoza is probably the first great liberal thinker in the world. And he is so liberal that he is excommunicated by his own Jewish community in Amsterdam, but not by the Dutch government. He's allowed to stay there. John Locke, the other great writer of liberalism, one of the founding fathers of liberalism, was kicked out of Britain, or England at the time, and he comes to live in the Netherlands. And what I mean by liberalism, this tradition, is not what we think of today in the United States. I mean the Enlightenment project that produced societies like the Netherlands, and then Britain, and then the United States. Open, liberal, democratic, ruled by a meritocratic process rather than monarchies, aristocracies, separation of church and state, protection of individual rights. All those things began with the Netherlands. And the reason it's so important is, in many ways, they are all threatened in much of the West at the same time today.
Just a quick follow-up. What was going on in the Netherlands that it started there, not in Spain or Portugal or Germany. What was going on culturally? Why the spark from there?
It's a great question. I mean, at some level, if you ask yourself, you know, the why this and why, you do end up with a slightly, it's unknowable. But what we do know is that the places that seemed to break out were places that were poor, didn't have many natural resources, were the most loosely governed parts of the old Roman Empire. So the Northern Europe and Britain were the least imperially governed by Rome, and so when the collapse of the empire happens, they kind of have the most leeway to do stuff. They don't have natural resources, so in a way, you know, they're not. You think of it like, I hate to put it this way because you all have kids, and my guess is you're all fall on one side of this, but the Dutch were not the trust fund kids. The Dutch were the scrappers. They were the hustlers. They had to find a way to make it. You often, Tom, have made the contrast between the Gulf states, the oil-rich states that have everything and somehow for decades and decades couldn't find a way to modernize, and Taiwan, whose only natural resource, a wonderful Tom Friedman line, is typhoons. And somehow they were able to take that and build, you know, one of the richest countries in the world. The Dutch had an element of that.
Very interesting.
Now, you know, and why they had that, was there a cultural element? I tend to be a little wary of culture. I find that, you know, maybe geography had something to do with it, political history had something to do with it. I find that, you know, when countries are doing badly, people ascribe it to their culture, and then when they're doing well, they ascribe it. So it used to be when Max Weber explained why the Chinese were not doing well at capitalism, he said, oh, it's, you know, Confucianism. It's what's retarding them. Now they say, why is it growing so fast? It's Confucianism. They are long-term thinkers and they save, and you know. So I tend to think the heart of realities are true. Talent is sprinkled through all cultures.
It is interesting, though, to note that many of our greatest companies were started in recessions. Intel, Microsoft, there's a long tradition of that. But then you move on to Britain. The Glorious Revolution. What was so glorious about it, Fareed?
So what's glorious about the Glorious Revolution is in some ways that it's, to me, the archetype of a good revolution. What I mean by that is a revolution that comes sort of from the bottom up. These forces are modernizing society, changing economics, changing technology, and the political elite kind of realizes that and tries to adjust and tries to moderate, not too much, tries to slow it down a little, shape it a little, give it some context, and in doing that manages to achieve this balance between progress and backlash. You know, not so much that it overwhelms the system, just enough that it maintains it. I contrast it with the French Revolution, which is kind of the opposite in many ways. But the importance of the Glorious Revolution is twofold. One, that it was this kind of moderate revolution where they restore a king, but they tell him, you don't have any power anymore. Parliament will rule. You know, they bring in a lot of Dutch ideas, along with William of Orange, the Dutch king who comes over and becomes the British king. But the second piece of why it's so important, why it's so glorious, is Britain becomes, using these new ideas, which really are Dutch ideas, Britain becomes the most powerful country in the world. And I wonder whether liberalism would have spread around the world and to the United States, for example, where there's a direct connection as to why it happened, because the colonists were all English. Without Britain, would liberalism of the form we know it now have spread around the world and become the kind of dominant, preferred form of government? I don't know. I think that's a very interesting way. It's like without Britain, would so many people around the world be speaking English? I don't think so.
Fareed, what do you have against the French Revolution? We think of the French Revolution as the mother of all revolutions. They gave us, as you point out, left and right. You could use the audience here as the example of the seating arrangement, but how could the French Revolution have been not a central feature in your book, but an example of something that failed?
So first, let me tell the story you alluded to, because it's one of my favorite little things that I discovered while researching. So do you know the reason we call it left wing and right wing and left of center and right of center, and we've done this for 250 years now? It's because around the time of the French Revolution, the National Assembly it wasn't then called the National Assembly, it was called by the king. The two-line story of the French Revolution is the king needs money for his wars. He tries to get Parliament to rubber stamp that request for taxation. Parliament says no and gets rid of the monarchy. That's basically what happens. So when Parliament is sitting down and deciding this, they used to sit according to their status in society. The priests first, then the noblemen, and then the commoners at the back. And they start to congregate on the basis of their ideological affinities. So the people who wanted to maintain the monarchy end up hanging out on the right-hand side of the chair. And the people who wanted to get rid of the monarchy end up hanging out on the left-hand side of the chair. And from that architectural division, we got 250 years of the left and the right, and left wing and right wing, which I think is, a fascinating story. The reason I am sort of anti the French Revolution is it is the opposite of what I described with the Dutch and the English. It's a top-down revolution. It's a revolution where a bunch of political elites, very smart, by the way, very, very smart and well-intentioned political elites, decide we're going to change everything. We're going to decree liberty, equality, and fraternity. We're going to get rid of the king. We're going to we're going to do all these kinds. We're going to get rid of religion. We're going to, people forget the extent of the radical nature of the French Revolution. They got rid of the calendar because they said it's all based on Christ, and we don't believe in that. And they, you can still find in Egypt, on the Sphinx and places like that, where Napoleon's army chiseled graffiti, and it says year 7, because it's year 7 after the French Revolution, which was the new calendar that they put in place. And it didn't take. And it didn't take because France was actually not, from the bottom up, a modernized society. It was a large, rich agricultural society, perhaps the most feudal society in Europe, along with Spain. Its wealth was vastly concentrated in a handful of nobles and the king. And so none of the forces that allowed for modernization in the Netherlands and Britain, the creation of merchants and traders, the creation of new wealth from in those forms, none of that existed. And so the whole thing collapsed. I mean, you can see the reality of the failed French Revolution by just putting it this way. The French Revolution began to overthrow the monarchy. It ended with Napoleon taking power and crowning himself Emperor of France. So by its own terms, it failed.
Interesting. But the reader, Fareed, would probably expect then to come to the American Revolution. And that doesn't figure centrally in your sort of concept of real deep revolution. Right. Explain why.
Yeah, it was a puzzle that I had to get very comfortable with and spend a lot of time reading Bernard Bailyn and Gordon Wood and people, great American historians like that. The American Revolution, if you think about what I was saying, was not a fundamental transformation of the social and economic basis of the society. I mean, in the South, the entire feudal aristocracy with slavery stayed completely intact. Even in the North, the large landowning structure, the class structure, even the voting structure, people forget, only propertied white men could vote, was pretty much intact. In fact, the colonists often said they were just asking for the rights that they had as Englishmen that were usurped by George III. If you read the Declaration of Independence, most of it is basically saying, we used to have this stuff, and then bad King George took it away. And so in a sense, it's better thought of, in my opinion, as a war of independence. There is an extraordinary element to it, which is largely the rhetoric around it, and then the Constitution. I think the two things which I probably should have emphasized more in the book, Jefferson's rhetoric with the Declaration and Madison's Constitution are path-breaking for the world. But in terms of changing American society, if you want to find a 20-year period that changed American society, it's not 1776 to 1796. It's 1860 to 1880. The Civil War and industrialization completely transform America. It goes from, you know, a feudal agricultural society to a modern industrial one, even in the South. The South is lagging behind, but you broke the back of slavery in many ways. And that transformation produces precisely the same dynamics that I described. You know, you get the rise of populism in the United States for the first time, a real populist party, a real populist presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, who runs 3 times for the presidency, and you get real backlash.
So let's double click on that for a second, because you argue that that was in many ways, the Gilded Age was a preview for our age of globalization, and William Jennings Bryan was in many ways the Donald Trump of his era. How so?
So at that point, we were still largely, politics was still deeply defined by economics. You know, I'm sure we'll explain why that changes, but so at that point, what starts to happen is you start to get a reaction to the extraordinary, massive industrialization that's taking place in America. And that industrialization largely has the character of factories being built, railroads being built, people moving off from farms into factories, from rural areas into cities. And all of that, just excuse me one second, there's something going on here. Oh. Sorry, this is what happens when you have smartwatches. And all that process is producing an enormous transformation for people who are not part of that new world. You know, the farmers, the old world. And they find a tribune in, it's called a populist party. William Jennings Bryan then takes it on for the Democratic Party. And what they want, in the language of the day, is they want silver, not gold. Because gold represents the interests of the new moneyed class who want low interest rate, high interest rates, tight money. They want to make sure there's no inflation. And these guys, the farmers, they want silver as the metal that backs the currencies, because they want inflation. They want, you know, they want their debts to be forgiven, as it were. And if I can tell one anecdote about that, I discovered this wonderful academic paper that interpreted The Wizard of Oz as a populist parable. So if you think about it, Dorothy comes from Kansas, and she goes to the land of Oz, O-Z, which is the demarcation of gold, right? To get rid of the wicked witch of the East and the West, the big cities. In the book, not the movie, the shoes she clicks on are not red, but silver. The people she meets along the way are the scarecrow, who is the farmer, who's scared, the tin man, who's the worker, who has no heart, because he doesn't realize all the ways they're misrating the country. And of course, the lion, who is William Jennings Bryan, who is all roar, great rhetoric, but no action.
So that's great. So now we're at, Fareed, a kind of 1989 moment. You argue, you know, that we're really end of the post-Cold War world, dominated by American power and ideas, and the two go together. And now it feels like we're entering a post-Cold War competition. And in some ways, what's happened in the last year, you know, I've been saying since, I asked myself, what was going on in the world on October 6th, day before Hamas invaded Israel? What was going on was actually Ukraine was trying to join the West, and Israel was trying to join the East. Ukraine was trying to join the European Union, and Israel was trying to normalize with Saudi Arabia. Russia stopped the first, and I would argue Iran and Hamas tried to stop the second. So we're actually at like a 1989 moment of between, I would say, a world of inclusion and a world of resistance, you know. And you talk about particularly Russia and China now really making a bid to supplant that age of Pax Americana. Talk about that competition tied to the current news.
So in a sense, of course, I agree with everything you said. I think that to me, in writing the book, the thing that I was surprised by, we all realize, I think, that Russia and China, one returning great power, one rising great power, find themselves uncomfortable in an American-dominated world. I would argue Russia much more so than China. And China, in many ways, was not sure. And I think Xi Jinping clearly is very uncomfortable in an American-dominated world. I would argue that the prior Chinese leadership was actually more interested in integrating into that world. But that debate, I think, it still exists in China. It just we don't see it because it's become a one-man dictatorship. But we understand the geopolitical element of it very well, right? This is what happens. History is the rise and fall of great powers, and as powers rise, they contest other great powers, and we're witnessing one of these great dramas. To me, the fascinating thing is the degree to which all three of the ones you mentioned, Iran, Russia, and China, are engaging not just in geopolitical balancing, but geocultural balancing. What I mean by that is for all three of them, the great threat is not just American power, Western hard power, military power. It's Western ideas. It's this liberal revolution that's taking place. Listen to Xi Jinping as he comes into power. He starts talking about how the Communist Party of China has spent too little time worrying about its own centrality, its own coherence, its own vitality. It's been willy-nilly liberalizing the economy, creating other centers of power, allowing all that to happen. But China is losing the dominant political organization that, in his view, is steering China in the right direction and keeping the country together. So what does he do? He cracks down on the private sector. He cracks down on something that would have been, unthinkable in China, which was a private sector man, Jack Ma, getting up and giving a speech and telling government regulators they were wrong. The idea that a private individual would tell the mandarins that, you don't know what you're talking about, you're doing this all wrong, was unthinkable. And so Xi Jinping begins, he's telling people we should remember the Cultural Revolution more fondly. Many people thought he wouldn't because his father had a very bad time there, but it's all about the central fear he has. Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, has written a wonderful book, his Oxford dissertation. After he was kicked out as Prime Minister, he went to Oxford and got a PhD on Xi Jinping thought, the thought of Xi Jinping. And he points out that he's plagued Xi Jinping by the example of Gorbachev and the Soviet Communist Party, a party that opened up society and found that society had no role, no space for the Communist Party. And so what he is searching for is a way to keep tabs on all this, tamp down these liberal ideas. In Putin's case, it's absolutely obvious. He's been, ever since he gained power, he has talked about Russia as the third Rome, the place that is going to preserve the original pre-Enlightenment ideas of faith and devotion and national pride. He gave a bizarre statement once, explaining how the West was now becoming chaotic and liberalism was decaying and was defunct because look at how they're treating J.K. Rowling because of her views on trans issues. But it's very thought through, and of course the Iranian mullahs live in fear of all these Western ideas. So I was struck down by the degree to which it's not just about hard power. It is about the desire not to get, as it were, infected by all these ideas. And it'd be very interesting to see, in my opinion, particularly in China, which is a great, vast, open civilization with hundreds of millions of people who desperately want to be modern and to want to be benchmarking against the best people in the world. Will you be able to make this work? Will you be able to tamp down on this and say, no, the state comes first, the party comes first, the outside world is in some ways suspect. It's a very tough balancing act.
So related to that, Fareed, is a point you make, and you alluded to it earlier, that you used to be able to look at someone's annual tax return and predict with a reasonable certainty which party they were in, whether working class or not. Now you need to look at their Twitter feed. What changed?
Yeah, so this is wonderful work that Ronald Inglehart, a great social scientist, did. He basically did these surveys from the 50s onwards, and he'd ask people, what are the values that matter the most to you? And what you'd find is in the 50s and 60s, when people talked about their political identity, it was shaped entirely by economics. As Tom said, basically if you worked with your hands and you earned less than the median income, you tended to vote left of center. And if you worked with your mind and you made more than the median income, white collar jobs, you tended to vote right of center. And that was true in the United States, it was true in Britain, it was true in Germany. And then what starts to happen, he finds, is that by the 60s and 70s, when you've created essentially a kind of mass middle class society in the Western world, per capita GDP, inflation adjusted in 1950 is about 15,000. By about 1970, it's doubled. So at this point, people start to express their political identity in terms of their ascriptive identities, if you will. Being a woman, being black, being Hispanic, being Jewish, being gay increasingly. And those identities become more important. And those identities begin to dominate. And there's a long period where it's kind of both are happening. But today, if you were trying to predict somebody's political leanings, you'd actually be misled by their income statement, because the majority of people who are doing well in that right of center category now actually vote for the Democrats, and the majority of the particularly working whites in America vote right of center. The best way to predict where somebody votes today is to ask, what are their views on the 3 Gs? God, guns, and gays. If you tell me where you stand on those, I can predict with almost mathematical certainty where you're going to vote.
Fareed, we used to have at the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, we used to have a receptionist, a lovely woman, and she was replaced, but not by someone from Mexico, but by a microchip. We got voicemail. Yet we tend to blame job loss. We tend to very much personalize it in terms of countries, and today none more than China. How did we get so afraid of China?
It's a great question. I think, as you say, these waves of change are happening so fast, and they're all mixed up. Technology is exploding at the same time that globalization is exploding. So we had these 2 seismic revolutions, and they're big. Don't get me wrong. This is not I know it's hard for us to believe because we've been living through it, but this is truly once in several centuries. So give you a sense of it. In the 1950s and 60s, when globalization was growing, after the World War II, so Japan joins the world economy, 50, 60 million people. South Korea joins the economy, 20, 30 million people at the time, those numbers. Singapore, South Korea. And then from about the middle of the 1980s to the middle of the 2000s, India, China, all of Latin America, Indonesia, Brazil, all join, right? That's about 3 billion people. So you think about the seismic effect that's going to have. I often think people talk about the China shock. It's not a China shock, it's a globalization shock. But at the same time, you have this absolutely extraordinary information revolution, which essentially replaces or takes the economy of atoms, where things move around, and replaces it with an economy of bits and bytes on top of it. And that's happening at the same time. So it's very hard to figure out which had the larger effect. But here's the problem. The information revolution is an abstraction. Even global capital flows are abstractions. People are real, right? People, you can think about people, and you can focus on people, and you can say it's those horrible Chinese, it's those horrible Mexicans. So if you think about Donald Trump's message, and there was a certain genius here, because he comes in as a Republican in 2016, And he's going, most Republicans at the time were preaching what I call the Reagan formula, low taxes, cut government spending, promote democracy abroad. That's what it means to be a Republican. And he says, no, I'll tell you what it means to be a Republican. The Chinese are taking your factories, the Mexicans are taking your jobs, the Muslims want to kill you. I'm going to beat them all up. You'll be great again. Right? That's the message of cultural chauvinism, and it's all about particular people. So maybe it's just that we find it very hard to believe that these impersonal forces are having these huge effects, and we search for, every Hollywood movie there's a villain, right? Who's the Bond villain stroking the cat? We're looking for him.
Do we have a choice? And that I've always thought myself that I'm a proud technological determinist, in the sense that if I have a cell phone with for zero marginal cost, I can call anywhere in the world, virtually for free, I'm going to use it. What I will use it for better or for worse, is another question. But there is a movement, I find, around this debate that basically says that maybe we should be slowing down technology, which is a good segue to the conclusion of your book, because these disruptions have led to this sort of deracination and a sense of rootlessness of a lot of people. Should we have a speed limit on microchips?
Yeah, it's the central question in a way. How do you shape or slow or guide these revolutions? Can you? I tend to be closer to your view, Tom, which is, at the end of the day, you can't, let's take AI. When people talk about, oh my God, AI is going to do all these things, and many of them could be terrible. So what are you going to do? Uninvent AI? You're going to tell people don't think about this? You're going to tell coders don't do that? Somebody else will do it. By the way, somebody else in some other country will do it. Your only choice, it seems to me, is to embrace the future, embrace modernity, embrace change. But here's the big difference I have, which is then use the wealth you create, use the opportunities you create, use the freedom you create to try to shape a better society. I think we have tended not to do that. We always talk about trade as being something that's good for everyone because it lifts all the boats, and in aggregate, everyone benefits. It's true, but there are pockets of people who get really affected. And so the obvious answer is we should take the gains, we should take the win, generate that wealth, and then spread it around. Help those people who are being disadvantaged, help those people who are in distress. And we really don't do that nearly as much as we should. And even when we do it with money, we don't do it with time and effort. Because for a lot of people, what has happened is the world that has passed them by, it's about dignity. I think you've said, Tom, many times into writing about the Middle East, that you found that a lack of dignity, a loss of dignity, is one of the core things that fuels a certain kind of passionate politics. I 100% agree with that. And I think, if you look at your great book, Lexus and Olive Tree, where you first start reporting on these revolutions, and you're talking about the world moving forward, with the Lexus, which in those days was a very fancy car, by the way, and the Olive Tree, of those clinging to the past. What's strange is you were talking about two different countries often. It's now happening in the same country, right? And we need to take the Lexuses and help the people who are holding on to their olive trees and help them understand and help them come, move forward. And we're not good at that. And we don't, and we haven't done that enough. And I think we need to recognize that. It's easy to say, well, all those people, those MAGA people, they hate us and they shout at. It's true. But I think at a broader level, culturally, there is an enormous amount of condescension that comes out of the world of urban, elite, multicultural, well-educated, high-paying America towards that other world. It's largely one of kind of ignoring them. I got the weeks after Donald Trump was elected, I wrote some tough stuff, nasty stuff about him. I got a very good, interesting email from somebody who said, I'm a big fan of yours. I've always liked your writing. I've always liked what you say on TV. But let me explain to you something about the rise of Donald Trump. He said, I live in rural America. I don't have a college degree. I work with my hands. He said, when I turn on television in America, it's as if I don't exist. Every show is set in Soho or in some loft in San Francisco. When I go to the movies, it's like I don't exist. All those people are yuppies and they're college educated and they're drinking lattes at Starbucks. When I listen to the music, it's all rap and hip hop. And when I look at the stars, you know, it's a world that seems to, in that world, I don't seem to exist. And I thought that put it very well, that it's not just about the money. It's about that sense to be these people have, that the world has just left them behind. And in many ways, when I believe that when you say, how can 85 million people believe that the election of 2020 was not fair? I don't think they really believe that. What they really believe is, I want to say F you to all of the establishment and the media. And I know what game you want me to play when you want me to condemn certain things, and I'm not playing that game. I'm just going to say F you.
I actually changed my business card in 2015 from a Thomas Friedman Foreign Affairs columnist to Thomas Friedman Humiliation and Dignity columnist to reflect what I actually was doing, which was covering people acting out on their sense of humiliation and questing for dignity. But Fareed, you end the book, and we'll end this part, and then we'll go to the audience question, but in an even deeper way, which you say it's just not all about economics either. We can have universal basic income, and that won't solve the problem. Now, I know this church is full every Sunday with this kind of overflow audience, but a lot of others aren't. Where do people find meaning today?
This is the central philosophical question that I try to grapple with in the conclusion, and honestly, I think I give it my best shot, but I can't tell you that I have an answer. Because I think what has happened is that people have lost that sense of certainty that religion and custom and tradition and community gave you. That sense of unthinking loyalty to certain ideas, to certain, passions. And what liberal democracy tells you is, the church was terrible at telling you how to live your life and what the meaning of life was. And those kings and those monarchs and those commissars and dictators, they were terrible in telling you that, your life was just about the glory of the nation or the glory of the monarchy. You get to decide what the purpose of your life is. That is what Jefferson meant by the third phrase, the pursuit of happiness. But it turns out, it leaves us deeply anxious and unmoored. What does that mean, And for a lot of people, it's much easier to consult the Bible or the Quran to find that meaning. And searching for that meaning, that certainty, leaves people, Kierkegaard calls freedom, anxiety, the dizziness of freedom. That you were dizzy with this freedom. Erich Fromm, this great psychologist, talks about how human beings, when confronted with this much choice and freedom, want an escape from it. He talks about, his great book is called The Escape from Freedom. I've often thought, for those of you who remember The Godfather, the opening scene captures that idea perfectly. So if you remember, there's an undertaker named Bonacera. He comes to Don Corleone, Marlon Brando, and he says, the first words are, I believe in America. I'm a good American. I'm an immigrant who's accepted the American values. I'm an individual. I work hard. And now I want to do an American thing. I want to make a deal with you. I want to make a transaction. I'll pay you what you want, and I want your goons to go and beat up these kids who beat up my daughter. And Don Corleone looks at him and says, what are you not understanding about my world? You're treating me like we're doing a contract. Here's how my world works. It's not a world of relationship. It's not a world of transactions. It's a world of relationships. If you want to come into my world, it's a pre-modern feudal world. You respect me as the Don. You call me Don Corleone. You treat me with that reverence and respect. You enter my world, maybe as a favor to you because you have been wronged. I'll take care of your problem. And maybe one day I'll ask you for a favor. And for those of you who remember the movie, he does ask him for a favor. And he leaves, Bonacera leaves that meeting kissing the ring of Don Corleone. So we've gone from the individual, transactional, atomized relationship of modern America We've escaped from that freedom back to Sicily and the feudal structure of Sicilian society. And that's because, these guys, they couldn't handle it. What do we do in the modern age to give people that sense of comfort and community and coherence that modernity has, what Walter Lippmann calls the acids of modernity have worn away? It's a huge challenge. For me personally, I am able to find some meaning to my life in my family and friends and in my community and in the values of freedom and and the idea that, maybe it's because I grew up in India, where whenever you think about this, it's very hierarchical, there is a certain sense in which I can still see the magic of freedom and liberty, but it's hard.
Fried, I want to go to, we got great questions from the audience. I want to pick out a couple. One is when I first started watching you on your great first show, Foreign Exchange, you talked a lot about your mentor, Sam Huntington, who offered the clash of civilizations as an explanation of the sort of dominant world system. Now we talk of the great power competition. Is the clash of civilizations over? Aren't these just labels used to justify policy preferences?
It's a very good question. No, I think Sam Huntington, who was my dissertation advisor and who actually had given me that article, that essay to read when I was just taking the job at Foreign Affairs. And I said to him, I'll give you the comments that you asked for, Sam, but may I also take it and publish it in Foreign Affairs? And he very, very kindly allowed me to do that. I think what he got right centrally was an incredibly important insight, which was as the Cold War had ended, human beings had been motivated and stirred by great ideological differences. The Cold War was fundamentally a battle of ideology, right? Think of North Korea versus South Korea, North Vietnam versus South Vietnam, East versus West. And what he said is, with that debate in the past, with one ideology having won and one ideology having lost, what you are going to find is human beings are going to go back to the things that divided them and defined them before these ideological divisions came up, which is culture, religion. And in fact, if you think about what that world looked like in the 90s and 2000s, so much of it was the breakdown of Yugoslavia, which was, Christians versus Muslims. So much of it was the war on terrors, which was, again, Christians versus Muslims. So much of the distancing that Russia has engaged in has been a kind of cultural distancing, saying we're not like the West, we're different. That's why the Third Rome is important, because it's a pre-Enlightenment idea of Russia's mission in the world. What I think Sam got wrong, and which the question gets to, is that does motivate people, but states are often motivated by national interest. And that national interest, sometimes you're with the people who are like you, and sometimes you're against. So when Saddam Hussein decided he wanted to invade a fellow Sunni, fellow Arab country, Kuwait, he didn't worry about the civilizational discourtesy of doing it. He just went for the oil, right? And now you have Russia and China, which are very different culturally, allying because they see a common enemy. So I think that the world of politics has always been one where realpolitik at the end of the day plays a very powerful role, and I think Sam forgot that.
I think globalization does too,
right?
And was also a restraining force in that. Fareed, India is currently the 5th largest economy in the world. Has India been able to have any major influence politically and economically in the South Asian region to counterbalance China?
India is going to have, I think, a large influence on its own terms if it chooses to. It does have some influence counterbalancing China, but frankly, you don't need India to counterbalance China. Xi Jinping is enough. Mm-hmm. Xi Jinping has done more to create balancing forces against China than anything any Indian prime minister could do. I mean, if you think about, again, this shift that has taken place in China from a country that was trying to integrate with the world and was busily solving all the disputes it had with its neighbors, to a country that goes to Australia, which was in those days having very amicable relations with the Chinese, and saying, here are 14 demands, And if you don't agree to these demands, we're going to stop buying your products. And those demands included things like your media has to stop saying bad things about China, which, you know, in a democracy, you kind of think to yourself, how would that even work? Look at the way they've been treating the Philippines, which wanted to ally with China for complicated reasons, but basically the Chinese behavior made it difficult. And the Chinese, you know, expansionist views of its sea lanes and its territorial waters has pushed the Philippines back into the United States' camp. Vietnam has always been suspicious of China, but the Chinese have not helped. Japan has always been suspicious. And then with India, you know, fascinating case again. India didn't think much about China. India is a very parochial country. If you polled people's attitudes towards China, 5 years ago, about 30% had a negative attitude about China. And then China decides to make a grab. It's a complicated story, but basically tries to assert a more dominant position in the disputed border that India has with China. This is a glacier up in the Himalayas. Nobody's sure what anyone would do with land in those, you know, it's tundra. But they went for it, and they got 40 square miles. India went from 30% negative views on China to 70% negative views on China, kicked out all Chinese investment, kicked out all Chinese apps, banned TikTok. So you ask yourself, like, was it worth it? I mean, maybe that land has some secret potential that I don't know, but it certainly seems like a mistake. India's opportunity is that it is another great Asian emerging market with the scale that China has, but it is also a democracy. And it has been able to be a democracy even when it was one of the poorest countries in the world. And so I think if India thinks of its rise properly, yes, it will get there's a lot of mileage to be had from being the next hot big market. And businessmen are now falling over themselves to go to India. India is, by the way, the second best performing stock market in the world over the last 10 years. But the magic of India, as I say this as somebody who grew up, would be if it can show the world a way to do this, a way to modernize, a way to move forward, and retain its core democratic values, its openness, its pluralism, its tolerance. And I worry a lot because India is moving forward economically, but in many ways it's moving backward politically. There is, you know, this is not just me, there are 3 institutes that rate democracies around the world, Freedom House, VDEM, and a third one. And all 3 of them no longer call India a liberal democracy, because the judiciary is no longer independent, media is largely muzzled, arbitrary use of government power is quite extraordinary. To give you a simple example, 95% of all politicians who have been investigated for income tax abuse belong to opposition parties. Maybe that's a coincidence, but it sure seems like an abuse of state power. So that part of it leaves me very sad, and particularly the treatment of Muslim minorities in India. But you know, I'm still very proud of having grown up in India. I'm still very proud when I see India rise this way, because, you know, the vast majority of Indians are not taking part in all of that. The vast majority of Indians are just trying to live a better life. And I think we sometimes forget that when we get into these kind of things. By the way, about China as well. The vast majority of Chinese people are just proud that they've been able to, you know, support their families and live a better life with greater dignity. If India can do both, I think it's a magical story for the world, because, you know, for much of the world, the question is, do you have to be a dictatorship to rise, or can you find a way to be open and free and tolerant and also rich? And I think India has an opportunity to really be a light among nations, to use a phrase used about another country.
Fareed, just to close, because it is so much in the news, is there anything your book would say help us explain or understand the struggle going on in the Middle East today?
Well, I think you foreshadowed it, Tom. I think what's happening, and it's a way, in a strange sense, I know it sounds very dark, we're in a very dark moment, but it's hopeful. which is that we're living through a big backlash, a big cultural backlash, and we're seeing it everywhere, right? The opposition to immigration, to globalization, to technology. Everyone's saying, stop, well, can't we go back to the 1950s when, women and minorities weren't uppity and US Steel ran the world? But really what we forget in all of this is this world is moving forward. This world is still moving forward. The world you described in the world is flat. It's still moving forward. And if you go to the Kenyas and Ghanas of the world, and you go to the Indias and Sri Lankas of the world, they're all trying to figure out, how do we raise standards of living? And as people raise standards of living, they do want a better life for themselves, not just economically, but politically, as they did in Taiwan, even though they're Chinese, as they did in South Korea, even though they're East Asian, right? And those forces are very strong. So when you were saying Israel is trying to join the modern world, or really accelerate
the Arab world.
The Arab world, that's a coalition of moderate Arab countries that want to break with their backward feudal past, and Israel, which wants to go one step even further, right, and open up even more. The place you can see it most clearly, of course, is Ukraine. Because here you have a fascinating example, right? Ukraine and Poland in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, were the same per capita GDP. One was able to go west and anchor itself in the West economically and anchor itself in the West geopolitically through the European Union and NATO. Ukraine was not able to do that. Today, Poland is 4.5 times richer than Ukraine on a per capita basis. But it's not just the money, it's that the Ukrainians look at how Poland lives its life, open, free, democratic, part of the modern world, part of the Western world, and they say, we want that liberal democracy, we want that liberal project so much, we will die for it, in the thousands, in the tens of thousands. And the Russians can keep slaughtering us and we will still defend it. You can stop funding us, Ukrainians have told me. We will still die for it. We should remember that when we think about whether liberal democracy and liberalism still is worth valuing and defending. Just look at the Ukrainians who are willing to die for something that we sometimes aren't willing to support.
So I just have 3 things to say in conclusion. Age of Revolutions by Fareed Zakaria. Buy it at Politics and Prose. Don't leave without it. Thank you very much, Fareed.
Thank you so much.